Trigger warning, this episode contains references to captivity, blood, and traumatic scenes. I'll handle the details with discretion. I've been on patrol and in K9 boots long enough to know the difference between a bad night and a night that follows you home. I've seen quick fights, chaotic overdoses, doors kicked in, and suspects cuffed on the curb. But there are a few calls, 3 in particular, that never settled into a neat explanation. They're not the kind of stories you tell to impress rookies. You tell them because they're true, because someone lived through them, and because they keep replaying when you try to sleep. The first is mine. I was a K9 handler for 9 years. My partner Rex was a 4-year-old German Shepherd who had been through tracking courses, apprehension training, and more nights than I want to count. He was steady. If anything, he taught me to listen. To his body language, to the little changes that told you a track had gone cold, or that a suspect was still hiding under a porch. On a clear Tuesday night, we were called to a house in a quiet subdivision, one of those streets lined with trimmed hedges and picket fences, where nothing seemed out of the ordinary until it was very, very wrong. The call came in as a foot pursuit. Neighbors had seen someone bolting from a residence, screaming, and then muffled sounds like a scuffle. Dispatch ran it as a priority, cars converging on a house with all the normal assumptions. Suspect probably inside, possible injuries, check for witnesses. The neighborhood smelled like summer, lawn clippings, a distant barbecue. No one imagined anything more sinister than a domestic argument that had spilled out into the street. The house itself looked untouched from the curb. Beige siding, a porch light left on, curtains drawn, no broken glass, no dislodged screen. We cleared the perimeter, called into dispatch, and sent a couple of officers to make contact with the neighbor who'd called it in. I had Rex on a short lead. His focus is the tool I trusted most. He doesn't fake it. If he tightened and pointed, I believed him. If he relaxed, I believed him even more. We did the methodical sweep you learn in training, clear the exterior, then the first floor. The living room held ordinary things, an overstuffed couch, a television on mute, a coffee table with a child's plastic cup tipped over at the edge. The kitchen had a faint smell of citrus cleaner. It all read like someone gone to work in the morning, not a violent scuffle. Upstairs, the air felt still in a way that set the hairs on my neck. Windows were closed, curtains drawn tight. No drafts, no open doors, no sign of forced entry. I checked closets, looked behind curtains, inspected under beds. Classic hide spots. Rex methodically worked the rooms with me at his side. He searched everything the way he always had, head down, nose working, ears flicking for a command. Then we hit the hallway at the end of the second floor. It was like walking into a different temperature. I remember thinking it was silly, that it was only my imagination. But Rex didn't think it was silly. He stopped a few paces from the bathroom at the end of the hall and stiffened. His hackles rose subtly, not the exaggerated puff you'd expect when he's excited. He went quiet, which for him was an alarm. He stared down the corridor, fixed on a point I couldn't see. Then he emitted this low, worn growl. It wasn't directed at me. It was aimed down the hall, steady as a metronome. His body translated something his nose couldn't explain. I raised my hand to give the standard hold and signaled backup to move in. We had 2 other officers with us, flashlights pocketed and eyes scanning. The light caught dust motes suspended in the beam, nothing more. The bathroom door at the end was closed. As a handler, the instinct is to let the dog lead if you believe him. We trained for suspect location, not ghosts, and Rex wasn't a creature of imagination. He responded to real cues. But training doesn't write rules for what to do when the only reaction you get is the animal's certainty and an empty room. We opened the bathroom as a team, lights slicing across tile and porcelain, no one there. The tub was clean, no hidden compartments. The medicine cabinet opened to reveal ordinary toiletries. The closet in the adjacent bedroom had racks of shirts, neatly hung. The bed had been made. There were no crawl spaces, no false walls, no signs someone had bolted through a back window. Every rational box we ticked came up empty. Rex sat at the threshold of the hall, every muscle coiled, nose pointed inward as if tracking a scent that hovered along the skirting board. We swept the rest of the upstairs and even checked the attic access. Nothing. We went outside and rechecked the perimeter for ground disturbance. We called the neighbor again, who repeated that they'd seen someone running out and then had heard what they thought were shouts, then silence. No one admitted anyone else had been inside when we arrived. We spent a couple of hours on scene, which on a quiet night feels like an eternity. The rest of the detectives argued the logical explanations. Maybe a transient used the place briefly. Maybe it was a frightened teenager who left through the back and someone cleaned up. Maybe the neighbor imagined parts of it. I wanted to accept those possibilities. I wanted to chalk it up to the kind of noise you file away and forget. But Rex didn't budge. Even after we'd left, he kept looking back at that hallway, as if the shape he'd fixed on might step back into view at any moment. The thing that unsettled me most was the scale of normalcy. The house was tidy, the bed made, the television off. People live messy lives where evidence piles up, crumbs, cigarette butts, signs of life. This house suggested none of it. It gave me only two options. Someone had been there and left clean as a whistle, or something had been there that didn't leave the kinds of traces human beings do. On the drive back to the station, Rex hopped into the back of the cruiser and sat with his head looking out the window, eyes tracking the passing trees. I watched him. He had an old nick near his right ear from a bite he took during training. He was a practical dog. If he reacted like that, it was never without a reason. I couldn't, in good conscience, say it was anything other than a sign that something had been wrong. Whether the something was human, or a trick of acoustics, or simply the result of a tired imagination after a long shift, we never found out. That night stuck with me. In the weeks that followed, we'd get a handful of calls to the same block. False alarms, a suspicious vehicle, a teenager's prank. Nothing connected, nothing that gave the missing piece. I kept revisiting the hallway in my head, replaying the way Rex had fixed on a spot that yielded nothing when we went to look. I replay my own decisions. Should I have lingered more, checked the HVAC, pried up floorboards? We do what we can with what we have. Training teaches you to prioritize life and evidence, and sometimes the biggest evidence is the behavior of a partner who can't talk. A week later I took Rex back, more out of stubbornness than hope. We walked through again with the homeowner present, an older couple who claimed they'd been away. They seemed sincere, bewildered. We checked the same spaces with thoroughness that bordered on obsession. The school of thought in the room that night was divided. One officer suggested a transient had used it and cleaned up before leaving. Another thought it was an elaborate prank gone wrong. I kept thinking about the way Rex's body language wouldn't waver. Dogs pick up on human odors, but his reaction was to something that to everyone else was not there at all. People told me later that I shouldn't let it get to me, that I'd seen worse, maybe. But it's a different thing hearing about violence and another thing to walk a hallway your dog refuses to enter and feel the air change. For years after, when I packed his vest for another call, I'd glance at his lined muzzle and wonder if he remembered that hall more clearly than I did. He seemed fine otherwise, tracking like a machine on regular calls, obedient and efficient. But every now and then, during a quiet patrol, he'd glance at a shadowed doorway, the way some people glance at old scars. Trusting him became less about training and more about acknowledging there are things trained police work can't always explain. If you're wondering whether we thought paranormal, that wasn't in our playbook. We didn't dress it up with ghost stories. We considered human explanations first, always. But the removal of the human explanation is what makes it linger. That rustle of certainty from a K9 who has stared down armed men and known when to run the other way. When he fixes on a spot and won't move, you pay attention. We left that night with the sense that the house had carried a memory of someone or something and refused to give it up. That refusal sat on us like a weight. Some months later, a different unit reported a call to the same street about a teen who had slipped and broken an arm on the neighbor's steps. I drove past the house on my way home that night. The porch light burned in its usual predictable way. People were cooking. A car idled in the driveway that hadn't been there before. Normalcy had slid back in and taken up residence like it always does. But I couldn't walk down that sidewalk as easily. I didn't tell the story to many people. It's the kind of thing that makes the bright edges of your work dull, not from danger necessarily, but from the knowledge that not everything in a life of service can be reduced to a report. If you want more true police stories like this, ones that don't always come wrapped in tidy answers, hit like and subscribe. There are more nights to go. The second story comes from a rookie officer who'd been on the job less than a year. I was working nights in a remote jurisdiction then, long stretches between calls, a lot of time to think and to practice radio brevity. This rookie, I'll call him Jason for the sake of telling it, sounded young on the radio the night he called in backup. He had a steady voice, but the kind of edge in it you don't get until you've seen a few things unravel in person. It was storm season, the kind of downpour that eats streetlights and turns the road into a mirror. The town's power grid had already taken a hit earlier that evening. Some neighborhoods were sitting in that blank grayness where private lights and emergency signs become the only small constellations. Dispatch, whose name on the logs is withheld, patched us through with a clipped report. A 911 hang-up, followed by a call where a voice claimed they'd been taken, then the line cut. The voice on the recording was odd, distorted by the line, pitched unnaturally high, like someone trying to be smaller than they were. It was enough to make even an experienced officer's stomach knot. Jason and I drove toward the address, our cruiser's wipers pounding a rhythm on the windshield. It was the kind of house the town had, an older bungalow with a sagging porch and an overgrown yard, screened-in steps, and the soft glow of a chestnut lamp on the inside. From the outside, it looked empty, unremarkable, if anything, neglected. We knocked, and when no one answered, we tried the door. It was bolted from the inside. Through the glass, the living room suggested hoarding. Stacks of newspapers, hanging clothes, an oversized stuffed doll seated in an armchair like an unwelcome sentinel. The homeowner's reluctance to open up when we finally made contact set the tone. He claimed to live alone, complained about storms and the power, and then offered a story that didn't line up with the caller's voice. He was evasive in a way that made the hair on my forearms prick. When someone acts like they have nothing to hide, that's one thing. When someone seems to be performing a role, that's another entirely. We attempted to resolve it without force, calling out to anyone inside, checking the yard, looking for signs of a struggle. We were met with silence, and increasingly, items that didn't match the homeowner's account. Children's shoes piled near the doorway, a diaper in the hallway, a cluster of toys that suggested more than the declared solitude. With the storm pummeling the house and the oddness of the 911 call, the decision to secure a telephonic warrant came down like a practical necessity. The law allows for exigent circumstances. Someone might be in immediate danger. The on-call magistrate processed the call electronically, one of those grey, efficient things that make you feel like your hands are tied to duty. We moved in pairs, lights on, voices measured. The house smelled of mildew and something sweeter beneath it, like fabric left damp so long it took on the odor of the house itself. The couch had an indentation like someone sat there often. The dining table hosted a scattering of mismatched plates. Upstairs, there were more of those personal artifacts. Women's clothing folded in a way that suggested use, not storage. A child's plastic cup half hidden behind a curtain. The oddness of it compounded with each small detail. Then there were the objects that set the hairs on the rookie's neck. An oversized doll propped on a shelf with one glassy eye slightly askew, a makeshift nursery constructed out of stacked boxes, a stuffed animal with a frayed ear. Nothing overtly violent, nothing overtly accusatory, but the collage built a pattern. Someone was keeping things in a way that implied long-term occupation by more than the homeowner claimed. At the end of a narrow hallway leading to the back of the house, a door sat with a thumbprint of scuffs along the jamb, as if it had been opened and closed countless times by someone with a rush in their hands. The basement entrance was down a set of wooden steps with a single exposed bulb that swung gently with each gust. From below there came a faint sound, an almost inaudible rattle, like something shifted against a metal surface. Jason, the rookie, told me later he felt his throat go dry at the sound. He peered into the dimness, a silhouette against the deeper dark, and said something I still remember. It didn't sound like rodents. We put 2 officers on the steps and called down before we went in. No answer. The old warning diagrams flashed through my head. Air circulation is poor in basements. The warmth of a body can make a place smell like someone lives there even if no one is present. But the sound wasn't a trick of structure. It was the sound of a person moving something intentionally. At the bottom of the stairs, the air turned heavy and cool. The single bulb cast long angles. We could see boxes lining the wall, crates, and a trail of what looked like damp footprints leading deeper into the shadow. The bulb swung again, and the beam of our flashlights revealed a path cleared through the disarray, as if someone had been led along it repeatedly. There were other, smaller things down there that didn't need to be spelled out to be understood. A narrow mattress tucked against the far wall, folded blankets, a pile of empty food tins, and a chair with straps looped across the arms. Nothing about the room signaled a normal domestic basement. It read like a place held for someone. We called the second time for anyone who might be present to announce themselves. We called louder. No reply. Back upstairs, the homeowner grew agitated, pacing in a manner that suggested somebody else was driving his behavior. He said he'd lived alone for years, that the 911 caller had to be a crank, but the items we found didn't match his story. The rattle that had drawn us down was audible again, and this time it was accompanied by a strained, altered voice, words folded into a tone that didn't sound like the man's natural speech. It sounded practiced, disturbed. We were working with limited light, the storm pressing against the house like a hand. Outside, the radio crackled. Our backup was still 10 minutes out over flooded roads. Procedurally, it was messy. Legally, we had the warrant and the exigency. Practically, we had to balance removing whoever was down there from danger and preserving whatever minimal scene could be preserved for investigation. We talked through the approach with clear commands and hand signals. The rookie's hands were slightly damp at his sides, but his jaw was set. We went to the basement door as a team, flashlights cutting the dark into squares. The whole house felt like something that had been closed off from the world for an extended time, air thick with stale breath and dust. When we set our shoulders to push the door, there was resistance at first, then a give, and it opened with a sigh. At that moment, we saw what we thought might be a pile of blankets shift toward the edge of the mattress. The rattle rose into something like breathing. We called out again, and a voice answered. Not the high-pitched distortion of the 911 call we'd heard, but a strained, adult voice that seemed to hold its syllables like a child being taught how to sound. We froze for a heartbeat, all the training and command presence condensed into a tiny, crucial decision. The rookie reached out with one gloved hand, and then stopped, like someone who'd suddenly realized the thinness of a line he'd crossed. He later described the smell, a mingled scent of old sweat and antiseptic, the way the man's eyes flicked when we shone light on him. Eyes that had been absent from town records. A man in his mid-40s who, by the crookedness of his beard and the dull intelligence in his pupils, had been there a long time. We secured the homeowner and called for emergency medical. The man we found down there was alive, disoriented, and lucid in the ways that left 1,000 small questions. The most unnerving thing was his voice. When he tried to answer our questions, he lapsed into a different cadence, speaking in short, almost childlike sentences that were not consistent with his age or circumstances. He would answer a question, then within a single breath recede into that altered tone, as if some coached script had been forced upon him for so long it had become the default. We took him to the ambulance undercover and began the paperwork of arrest for the homeowner. There was a long, ugly aftermath. Interviews, forensics, neighbors who claimed they never suspected anything. The captain wrote up a report, we gave statements, and the town buzzed for a few days about the rescue. There was gratitude from the man we pulled out, thanks whispered over the beeping of the monitor, but there were also gaps. Why was he made to speak that way? How long had he been held? Who had been involved? The medical team handled the immediate physical care. The psychological shadows required specialists. Jason, the rookie, never spoke about it in a way that made him sound like a hero. He'd be the first to tell you he just did his job. But there was a look he carried home for a while, a sensitivity that made his eyes drag sometimes when he looked at the parents in the grocery store aisle and consider what private horrors might be behind closed doors. The humane parts of us wanted to understand everything. The procedural parts wanted evidence. We had both, and it still wasn't enough to explain the human cost of what we found. I told you I'd been a K-9 handler. I'm not the rookie who went down into that basement. But like every officer who walks the beat in small towns, I heard stories. We passed them around like currency, cautionary tales about what to watch for in neighbors, signals that something isn't right. But the thing with that call wasn't just the physical captivity. It was the way the victim's speech had been altered, like an instrument tuned to someone else's hands. That's the kind of thing that doesn't just provoke immediate action. It changes how you listen to people afterwards. We left that scene with a sense of relief, tempered by the nagging knowledge that rescue doesn't erase the rest. There were things we could document and prosecute, and there were things that lived in the dark grooves of memory and required a different kind of care. Jason lasted on the job. He later moved into investigations and told me the job had a way of making you numb in front of certain atrocities, then overly sensitive in other parts of life. He'd sleep with the radio in the next room for months after. We filed reports, turned over evidence, and watched the wheels of the system turn. The man recovered physically in the hospital and gave a statement eventually, though he never quite left us with full answers about the voice. Some things, the investigators said, were consistent with methods of coercion seen in other cases: isolation, role reinforcement, long-term psychological shaping. Others didn't fit neatly into any known pattern. We resisted easy labels. If there was a lesson at all, it was the reminder that normal exteriors can conceal long-term captivity, and that a single 911 call, even one as malformed as the voice we'd heard, can be the thin thread that unravels it. We thought that was the end of it. We thought that was closure. The town slept easier for a while, but the world of policing is not a sequence of closed files and written lessons. It's a series of nights where you return to your own home and watch your partner sleep, wondering who you might by accident let a past life slip over. The experience stayed with the rookie in quiet ways. He'd tell you he learned to listen more closely to weirdness, to trust the little things, a mismatched shoe, a man nervous to invite you into a kitchen. I could stop here and let you breathe. But there's a third night I have to tell you about, one that ends not with rescue, but with an unanswered door and a question that doesn't go away. It was a call that began as a hang-up at 2 in the morning and turned into one of those cases where you look back and realize how ordinary everything looked from the outside. The neighborhood was the kind you'd drive through and say to your passenger, "Nice place to raise a family." Streetlights stood like watchful actors, and porches had chairs with quilts thrown over them. The call came in as a 911 hang-up. A neighbor followed up. She'd heard a muffled scream and then nothing. The line cut. Dispatch told us the report and patched the notes across the channel. I was on a solo patrol that night, the kind where the radio feels heavier than usual and the dark seems to collect at the edges of the windshield. On arrival, the front door of the house in question was cracked, just enough to see a sliver of the foyer. The inside smelled like a sink of unwashed dishes left sitting too long. Stale water, a metallic tang. The living room had a glass half full of something on a coaster, a paperback open face down on the coffee table. It read like someone had stepped out for a minute and never returned. That specificity is part of what makes being an officer strange. Small domestic details tell a story if you let them. I announced myself as I moved through the first floor, light sweeping the hallway and catching on family photos, smiling faces in frames, the sort of curated albums that sell suburbia as safety. The upstairs was a different story. A bedroom seemed to have been lived in not long ago, sheets rumpled, a closet open with clothes strewn like they'd been grabbed in a hurry. The bathroom at the end of the hall had a small, very modern sink. On the rim, there was a shallow pool of blood. Not a theatrical amount, not splashy. Clinical, precise, the kind of thing that made you think about where it had come from and why it had been left. I called for backup and described what I saw. The dispatcher, name withheld, acknowledged and told me units were en route. When you're alone in a house and find a scene like that, you think in chapters. First is the practical, secure the scene, check for life, call for medical. Second is the procedural, document, collect, secure. Third is the human business. How do you say what you just saw without changing the tenor of your focus? The house had no sign of forced entry from the street. Nothing obvious matched a violent struggle like you'd see on TV. It was small clues that added up to a sense of something gone sideways. At the foot of the stairs, a carpet was streaked with dark smears leading down toward the basement door. The light from above failed to pierce the stairwell. Sometimes basements are passive in the narrative of a house. They hold Christmas decorations and boxes, cold in the winter. Other times, they are where people hide things. I took the stairs carefully, hands on the rail, pistol holstered but at the ready. My flashlight painted the wall in a narrow band. But halfway down, the beam caught the edge of a chair with zip ties strapped to the armrests. The chair, for me, was the fulcrum moment. Even with all the training, the thing you fear most is when a household item, the familiar domestic object like a chair, becomes evidence of intent. That chair bore the marks of constraint that suggested someone had been held. Near it, the concrete floor had a pool in the shape of a handprint that had spread and dried, leaving a melancholy stain. The air went still in a way that made it hard to breathe, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to be interrupted. I called down again, but this time there was movement. A shape at the far corner. Then, sudden and explosive, a figure bolted toward the basement window. They shoved through it, glass spraying like a liquid, and were gone into the black beyond. I gave chase across the yard and into a span of trees, but the night was thick, and the storm earlier had muddied prints. For a while my flashlight was only catching dashes of movement and leaves that weren't human. I lost them. Afterward, investigators would trace evidence. Shards of glass, footprints, a wallet found upstairs that belonged to the homeowner. The blood taken from the basement matched the homeowner when we ran the preliminary checks, but the homeowner himself was missing. No body, no confession, and no sign that he had left on his own. A neighbor later told us he'd left that evening to take a walk and called his wife to say he needed air, an innocuous phone call. But the presence of the chair, the zip ties, the blood, and the sudden flight of a figure meant the case straddled two realities. We had hard signs of an altercation and the absence of a person who should have been there. You'd think the kind of closure you get from arrest or confession would dull the edges, but what stayed with me was the normalization people applied to the house afterwards. Life circled back around it like a tide. Children played on the sidewalk, a lawnmower hummed, an ordinary mailbox sat on a post. That was the source of a persistent unease, that horrific things can be folded into normal life so smoothly they become invisible, until someone like me lifts the corner of the rug and finds the stain beneath. The next days had detectives crawling the property, the neighbors talking, and the news hitting a rhythm of speculation and caution. We did witness interviews, took swabs, and compiled the initial timeline. We had leads that fizzled, and a suspect we chased down until the trail ran cold. For the homeowner's family, the ambiguity was a different kind of wound. For investigators, the file sat in a stack that gets colder the longer it goes unresolved. For me, it meant driving by the house later on my way home to see a soccer goal in the yard and wonder what had happened on a night when a man vanished and a chair held the secret. Those were the 3 calls, 3 separate nights, 3 kinds of bruises that civilian life never quite understands because it doesn't spend its nights listening for a radio. What connects them is not a dramatic reveal or a cinematic explanation. It's the ordinary exterior of neighborhoods and the way human lives bend inside walls in ways we can't always see from the curb. They don't make you less committed to the work. They make you more careful about the small things. A dog's stare, a muffled voice, a chair buckled with zip ties. There's more to the second and third calls. There are interviews we haven't gone through, paperwork we haven't mentioned, and a string of choices I made that I still think about. I can tell you the rest, about the questions that never got answered, and the nights when the radio was all that kept me company. But that arrives on a different night, when the facts have been sifted and the fatigue has a sharper edge. For now, remember the 3 things that tie them together. Trust your partners, human and animal. Look again when a scene feels ordinary, and know that the lack of an explanation doesn't make an event any less real. If these stories have you on edge, tell us which one unsettled you most in the comments. There are more pieces to each of these nights, the interviews, the follow-ups, the small human moments that get left behind when the sirens fade. After I left off that night, the work of follow-up began in ways that look bureaucratic from the outside, but feel messy and damned personal when you're the one who answered the call. Reports get written, evidence is logged, detectives take sworn statements, magistrates sign things, and attorneys move pieces across calendars. But the parts that don't fit a form, how a dog won't look at a hallway again, how a man never really finds his ordinary voice back, those are the things that tuck themselves into your life and show up unannounced. With Rex's hallway, we circulated the details through channels that matter. Patrol briefing notes, a short supplement to the initial call, and a heads-up for neighboring units. Neighbors were re-interviewed, field canvasses were done, and we checked property logs for visitors. Nothing came of it. No missing person report connected, no surveillance turned up, no CCTV capturing movements on that street that night. Detectives said it was one of those cases where every rational avenue came up empty. We closed the paper piece for the station's immediate needs, but none of us ever closed it completely in our heads. Rex retired not long after. Age and the nagging arthritis that catches up with working dogs. His retirement was routine, ceremonial even. He's the kind of animal who earns that soft landing. But even after he left full-time work, he'd give that same locked stare sometimes towards certain rooms, or he'd refuse to lie near the stairwell if it was dark. It wasn't theatrical, it was small, practical things. Those moments told me what I'd always know. Animals index reality differently than we do. They feel currents of human behavior and sense long gone. You don't have to believe in the supernatural to accept that there are forms of information we don't process well. For the rookie and the basement rescue, the wheels of criminal justice turned in a way that gave the town a semblance of answers and yet left a stack of unanswered hows. The homeowner was arrested on charges related to unlawful confinement and other counts consistent with what we found. Victim advocacy groups stepped in, prosecutors assigned counsel, and the man we pulled from the mattress underwent medical and psychological evaluation. In court files you can see dates, arraignment, pre-trial hearings, motions filed, but you won't find the slow human pacing of recovery or the private meetings with therapists that came after the charges. Those are not docket items, they're less tidy. Investigators talked openly about psychological coercion as a plausible framework for the altered speech pattern. How isolation, repetition, and control can reshape a person's responses until they sound rehearsed, like a voice that belongs to someone else. Experts we consulted called it role-enforced behavior, a method used in long-term captivity cases to dull resistance and create dependence. That offered part of the explanation, but not the sort of full closure that settles a stomach. The man we rescued remembered fragments, names, smells, the cadence of commands, but there were gaps that prosecutors wanted filled and memories that needed care more than interrogation. Jason, the rookie, moved into investigations as time went on. He said the event stayed with him less like a single image and more like a new filter through which he read the world. He'd point out small things to his partner now: the wrong shoe size next to a front door, a stack of mail left unclaimed because someone was too controlled to get it, a window blocked by heavy drapes when kids live in the home. He told me those are the things that led to other rescues later, small threads you tug until they reveal a bigger weave. He learned patience, the kind that persists beyond adrenaline, and a compassion that takes a practical shape. Check in again, choose words carefully, give survivors space. The third call, the one with the chair and the zip ties, finished first at the scene and then stretched into one of those files that sits cold and jagged in your drawer. Forensics took samples and came back with the blood matching the missing homeowner's DNA profile. That fact is a government form, scientific, clean and cruel in its implications. The man was unaccounted for. Leads were pursued, cell phone pings checked, ATM footage pulled, interviews conducted with neighbors who said they had seen him take a walk that night. Patterns were looked at. Every conceivable travel route canvassed. Nothing produced the person or a clear trail. We had a suspect early on, someone seen in the neighborhood that night, fitting a general description. We chased that lead hard, followed up on license plate traces, and interviewed people who'd come forward. For a while, it felt like the hunt would close. Then the trail frayed, alibis that held up, surveillance that timed out, a witness who couldn't identify the person in a lineup. Investigators tried to weave together motive and opportunity. Prosecutors judged the evidence and made plea bargains where they could, but the homeowner's location remained unknown. The file sat heavier for that reason. A missing person is a different kind of weight, the unanswered absence of someone who, by every account, should have been accounted for. That makes the job lonely in ways people outside the line of duty don't always see. You return to the same whiteboard of procedure, better canvases, public appeal, check the unremarkable. We issued leaflets in the neighborhood, we established a tip line. Volunteers printed flyers that people thumbed through at grocery store counters. The community offered condolences and conjecture in nearly equal measure. In public, people wanted updates. In private, the neighbors who'd called in the scream wanted reassurance that everything possible had been done. We gave them the steps we could take, the things we had done, and the honest, unsatisfying truth that sometimes investigations run into silence. One of the persistent lessons across these three calls is the way routine surfaces, chores, playdates, lawnmowers, sat atop the very difficult truths we found. Ordinary life absorbs the extraordinary until it becomes background. I can't count the number of times I've been in a living room where a child's toy sits beside a police blotter. It looks incongruent to someone who doesn't live in the swirl of incidents, but it's the real texture of the work, the domestic and the dangerous braided together. Those contrasts are not cinematic, they're exhausting. Emotionally, the calls etch themselves into people differently. Some officers talk, process, and let the scene get its place in memory like a filing cabinet. Others hold it tighter. For me, and for many I worked with, some calls manifested as small changes. Sleep that feels more scheduling than rest. Scanning crowds, not for faces but for shifts in posture. An impatience with obviousness. You check in with your partner before you enter a house. You notice where the dog looks. You catalogue a door's scuff marks. You become a species attuned to subtle inconsistencies, because subtlety is often where the truth hides. We tried to respond to those indirect wounds the way departments are increasingly doing. Peer support teams, counseling referrals, and informal debriefs where officers are encouraged to unload the raw parts of a call without shame. It's not enough to prescribe a debrief. The culture must permit vulnerability. I saw officers who were reluctant at first gradually open up in those rooms. They spoke in practical terms. How they handled the childlike voice in the basement, how they held back from chasing a person through trees and failing, how a dog's stare pointed at something no one else could see. They described the anger, the impotence, and the odd tenderness that surfaces when someone is rescued, and you realize what they lost while they were gone. Sometimes people ask if the job numbs you. It doesn't exactly. It rewires you. It teaches a kind of compartmentalization that is necessary for repeated exposure to violent or traumatic events. But compartmentalization is not dissociation. The weight of these specific calls lingered. They showed up in small moments. The handler who refused to walk alone past a certain porch. The rookie who started carrying a small comfort item in the patrol car for survivors. The patrol officer who glances at suburban mailboxes and wonders what privacy might hide. These are not dramatic changes. They are quieter, slow accruals of caution and care. And then there is the public angle. We have to keep people informed, but not alarmed. We balance urgency with accuracy. In the second call, the community's awareness, people checking on lonely neighbors, organizing drives, helped. For the missing homeowner, the attention sometimes bred speculation that hurt investigators and families alike. The internet spins narratives fast, and rumor can be both helpful and harmful. We worked with community liaisons and victim advocates to provide vetted information. That work matters because it shapes how people respond and whether future victims find a way to ask for help. Ultimately, the 3 nights I'm telling you about share a thread: the limits of sight and the insistence of small cues. A dog that refuses a hallway points at something our senses don't easily capture. A distressed 911 call, even a distorted one, can be the thin filament that unravels long-term abuse. A chair with zip ties and a bloodstain disturbs the comfortable narrative we build about safe streets. None of these are supernatural by necessity. They are, however, inexplicable to the degree that ordinary logging of facts leaves an emotional vacuum. Those vacuums are filled by speculation, by nightmares, and by a professional obligation to keep searching. So what do we do with not knowing? We do the work we can do. We improve canvas methods. We listen to the cues animals give us. We treat distorted calls as urgent until proven otherwise, and we place survivors' dignity at the center of our responses. We advocate for resources, therapy, victim support, investigative tools, because the human aftercare is as crucial as the initial rescue. And we pass the stories on, not to titillate, but to train others in the craft of noticing. If there is a final, practical piece of advice that runs through all 3 nights, it is this: when something feels off, say something. Call the non-emergency line if you think a situation is suspicious. If you hear a strange voice on a call or a child's cry, cut off abruptly, speak up. Those thin threads sometimes become stronger when someone else tugs with you. For us, a K9 stare, a frightened 911 voice, and a bloody chip in a basement floor were all things that could have been dismissed. They weren't. Someone acted. That is how rescue starts. I still drive past that house on occasion. The porch light is often on, a lawnmower passes, a family car is parked in the driveway. Life continues. For all the procedural steps we take, for all the evidence we collect and the arrests we make, a part of this work is living in the tension between what we can fix and what we cannot. The unresolved remains unresolved. The rescued carry scars. The dogs carry memory. And the rest of us carry the habit of looking twice. If one of these three stories stayed with you, if one unsettled you more than the others, tell us which in the comments. Subscribe if you want more in-depth, true law enforcement tales, and remember that behind every headline there are people, officers doing their jobs, survivors rebuilding pieces of life, and neighborhoods that contain more than what you see from the curb. Thank you for listening.